welcome back. Alright, now, you know, there's a lot of things that we aren't going to like about how we deal with climate change. The truth of the matter is, none of the options that we're going to learn about in this module of the course are great, okay? But the ones about adaptation can kind of seem a little bit like sticking your head in the sand, like ostriches hypothetically do. They don't, but whatever. The truth of the matter is, adaptation is going to have to be part of our strategy, and frankly, there are lots of advantages to relying on adaptation as one of our main ways of dealing with climate change. I mean, you might be surprised to hear me say that, but actually these sort of wait and see what happens and then deal with it then type adaptation strategies may not actually be so bad. I mean, for one thing, because many of the worst impacts of the climate change are expected to happen later in the 21st century or even farther into the future, this adaptation strategy gives us plenty of decades to plan how we're going to, before we have to do anything. Which again sounds a little bit like an ostrich sticking his head in the sand, but it's actually not a terrible plan at all. It allows us to resolve any uncertainty about how the climate change is going to happen or how we should respond. It sounds kind of awful, but it actually makes our response a lot more focused too. It helps us, you know, we're only going to make adaptations to the things that actually end up happening, not things that might happen. Okay? I mean, it sounds a little bit ostrich with his head in the sandy, but that's actually not a horrible thing. It also, you know, in the end, it might not cost that much if we do adaptation. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if global values of affluence continue to increase, maybe proportionally, climate change won't actually cost as much if we just wait in the future. Now, that's a big if, but it's possible in the future there'll be enough global affluence we can afford these kind of mitigation and adaptation strategies. So, you know, waiting until a few more decades is not the world's worst idea. It's not a great idea, but none of these options are going to be great. Another reason why it's actually not the world's, adaptation is not really the world's worst option as far as how to deal with climate change, is that adaptation doesn't require complicated national or international agreements, treaties, obligations, because it's really hard to get the governments of the world to do that kind of stuff. I mean, you know about things like the Kyoto Protocol, which was that big international agreement to try to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. And there have been other more recent attempts to try to create such international treaties and international obligations. And you probably know, none of them really worked all that well, and they were really complicated negotiations. Adaptation doesn't have that. Adaptation is, we're going to wait till we see what happens, and then we're just going to deal with it when it comes. And that might be politically easier, that might be, you know, an easier sell to the public, etc. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Number three, adaptation might actually be a good thing in that it reduces our vulnerability to other environmental crises, not just climate change. For example, if we have to deal with sea level changes at some point in the future, well, dealing with sea level changes also addresses our vulnerability to hurricanes and so on. If we move big chunks of the world population away from the shorelines, that's actually not a terrible thing for reasons other than global warming. So I mean, you know, adaptation, just sort of sitting around and just wait and see what happens, might sound like a terrible solution. Might not even seem like a very viable policy option, but in many ways it's not our worst bet. On the other hand, it may kind of make us seem a little bit like the dinosaurs. We're just sort of sitting around waiting for the comet to hit us, right? I mean, there are serious disadvantages to relying on adaptation as our main way of addressing climate change. For one thing, adapting to climate change is going to be a whole lot more expensive than we're expecting. And as a consequence, the wealthier nations are going to be able to deal with it and do the adaptation way more than the poorer nations of the world will. And frankly, that is such a big reason why we should be worried about climate change and about adaptation as a strategy that in fact I'm going to make that the only reason we're going to talk about here in the lecture. Your book actually mentions a few others, but that's the one that makes most sense to me as being why we should focus on it. See, here's the deal. The rich countries are the ones that caused most of the climate change, but now it's going to be the poor countries who bear most of the harm. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if, let's say, because of climate change, food prices go up, here in the West, you know what, we're going to complain about it, we're not going to be happy about it, but we can afford it. We can afford to pay more for food. We can outbid the poor countries when it comes to food. So whereas higher food prices are an inconvenience in America, they're a life and death issue in some parts of the world. Well, we're the ones who caused the problem. Why are we getting off relatively easy just because we're rich? And why are they having to deal with such big problems because they're poor? And there's pretty broad international agreement in entities like the United Nations and so on that that's just not ethically acceptable. It's not viable in terms of international security and so on. There's good reasons why we just can't let that be the way the future plays out. So there's pretty good agreement that the rich nations of the world need to provide economic assistance to the poor nations of the world to deal with climate change. There's also, however, and that's, by the way, built into things like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Climate Convention, what is it, from 2015? And they're all built in there, and there's also pretty good agreement, though, that so far the rich nations are doing practically nothing. So far, there's been virtually no actual, bringing of a climate plan forward for the poor countries of the world. And you know what? It is a really important question to ask. You know, we often think of climate change as being something, well, the rich people will survive, the rich people being Americans and Western Europeans and the Japanese and so on. But really, I mean, if you think about it, we think of ourselves as kind of fat, dumb, and happy, but are we really wealthy enough to afford adaptation to climate change? Do we really have enough resources to deal with a world where we have to pay to move large parts of the population away from the coastline, or pay more for access to fuel, or pay more for access to electricity, pay more for heating and cooling, and so on? Are we really wealthy enough to afford that? Well, it kind of depends on what we mean by being successful and making a successful adaptation to climate change. I mean, are we headed for extinction as a species or as a Western civilization or something like that? Well, frankly, no. We're probably pretty adaptable. We'll probably find ways that avoid, like, driving our species to extinction over climate change. Will we be able to maintain our standard of living, on the other hand, is a much more complicated question. We don't actually yet know how much of our resources and our money and so on will be spent fighting climate change. Wow, the fire just flamed up all of a sudden. We don't really know what this is all going to end up costing, and not everything that's important about climate change is easily measured in dollars. I mean, how do we talk about our standard of living when we're talking about things like polar bears? What is the value of polar bears? Or what is the value of some species that could go extinct, or some habitat that could be lost or something under climate change scenarios? That's not really an easy thing to tabulate. So if we were trying to figure out what is the bottom line about adaptation as a climate change adaptation scenario, the truth is some amount of climate change is unavoidable. The truth of the matter is we've already committed to a certain amount of climate change due to greenhouse gases we have already emitted into the Earth's atmosphere, and there's nothing we can do about it. As we sit here around the campfire, emitting carbon into the atmosphere, but admittedly this is all just yard waste I'm burning over here, the truth of the matter is a certain amount of climate change would happen even if we stopped burning fossil fuels today. There's nothing we can do about that. Thus, adaptation has to be part of our response. We can't really avoid having to adapt. We probably will have to find ways to change how people live in certain parts of the world. We're going to have to change out what crops we grow and so on. But relying on adaptation as our only way to deal with climate change is very problematic. There are serious ethical problems with making it so that the rich people can adapt more easily than poor people can. It could be much more expensive than we think. It may turn out to be more expensive than even the rich people can afford, and so on. No matter what, adaptation is our very expensive strategy of dealing with climate change. It may turn out it will certainly be more expensive than the poor countries of the world can afford, and it may turn out to be more expensive than the rich countries of the world can afford. That makes relying on adaptation a really big gamble. The truth of the matter is, when we look across the spectrum of options we're going to have as to ways of dealing with climate change, there's no doubt about it, adaptation has to be part of how we deal with climate change, but it is not a serious policy option. We simply can't plan on adaptation. Adaptation is sort of the absence of a plan. Alright, before we move on then to the next lecture and start talking about some of the other ways in which we could deal with climate change, let's ask two more questions real quick. Question 3. If we wait until climate forces us to make adaptations, A, making the necessary adaptations will be more expensive than doing so in advance of the warming. B, we'll be able to focus our adaptations just on outcomes that actually happen, not ones that might happen. C, global changes in affluence might actually make these adaptations more affordable in the future than they are now. Or D, all of the above. Which of these is the right way to think about what would happen if we just wait until climate change forces us to do something about it? Make a choice from those four options and give me get a little feedback before you move on to question 4.